Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Well, a lack of infrastructure has long been a matter of concern in Africa. It is one of the challenges behind doing business on the continent. Could infrastructure regulation in Africa be the reason behind the lack of infrastructure development on the continent? What can be done to reform the regulatory systems as well? Well, we are joined now at the desk for this infrastructure regulation discussion in Africa specifically. We're joined by Greg Knott. He's the head of Africa practice at Werksmans Attorneys, as well as Gloria Mamba, MD at Global Environment Fund. Clearly it's a show filled with G's today. Gloria, Greg, Gugu. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Gloria.
But getting into the nitty-gritties of the discussion today, infrastructure development, rather regulation behind that. And Greg, clearly there is a need for this, but why so? What is the state of regulation at the moment when it comes to infrastructure?
Well, I think, Gugu, first off is that, you know, when one talks of Africa, we're always bemused by this great continent, and it's made up of 50-odd states, and that always must be held in mind. So when we talk of Africa, it's all those various jurisdictions, and with each jurisdiction comes either a regulator or no regulator, in which case maybe. So it just really depends on the jurisdictions as to the various regulators. Having said that, and you'll also get two camps, by the way, You'll have one who says we don't want any more regulation, and the other camp that says, well, more regulation is needed. At the end of the day, a fair amount of regulation is needed, obviously in different sectors. I think of the power sector for one, which I'm familiar with. Gloria, no doubt, will talk about the financial sector. But there is a need, obviously, because investors at the end of the day want certainty. They want to approach a particular project or projects with the certainty in mind, saying, well, there's a regulator who can make the actual landscape fair for the particular investor. And that's important. At the end of the day, investors want that certainty.
Indeed. Gloria, I take it you agree with Greg's sentiments there that to drive or encourage certainty, or rather investment, investors need the certainty. To get certainty, we need regulation.
Absolutely. I think what's certain in this matter is that regulation in and of itself is always a hot topic and one that gets a lot of emotions going. But the truth of the matter is that you want the certainty of knowing what the environment looks like. I think in the long run it absolutely benefits the consumers of infrastructure, in power, in telecoms, in the water, the various sectors that there are, just because what it does is it creates it enables an environment in which you can have low cost, efficient systems, and everybody benefits from that, the investors and the consumers as well.
Perhaps, Gloria, you can enlighten us from a financial perspective as to what the state of regulation is at the moment, perhaps from an infrastructural perspective as well?
I think the point that Greg made earlier is absolutely critical. It varies from country to country. So you have certain countries, I think on the continent, at last count, there were something like 20 regulators of electricity and 9 of water. And they are not all in the same country, okay?
Sure.
And the legal regimes that determine how the regulators establish the roles that the regulator has, whether the regulator advises the minister or is in actual fact independent and can set tariffs and rules for operating in that space without reference to the minister, differ from place to place. What I will say is that for someone who's investing, the preferred environment is one in which we believe that the regulator has significant independence, that the regulator is able to develop a tariff regime and rules around licensing and concessions that are understood and transparent, and that in the long run are able to allow investors to have some line of sight for the duration of their investment as to what they can expect.
Greg, perhaps you can also give us further enlightenment. You heard Gloria's sentiments there that it seems as though the large majority of regulators are in the energy space. Does this perhaps highlight where all the infrastructural development perhaps is taking place? Or what does this indicate perhaps?
I think there are great demands on energy, and there's been a great build-out of energy projects across Africa, and hence the need for regulators, given foreign investment as well as local state institutional development. So I suppose the focus has been, it's been in the spotlight. The regulator and energy sectors are, dare I use the word, sexy, you know, so they're there and they're seen. But I think there are other spaces that Gloria has spoken to, the financial institutions. You're going to find it in other utilities, water utilities and so on. The regulator will gain more and more prominence as those particular infrastructure projects, so they develop across the continent.
Gloria also highlighted something which is so important, and that's the independence of regulators. And just coming back to that, you mentioned varying degrees of independence, setting tariffs and all of that. But who regulates those regulators?
This is a big challenge, Google. You know, the issue here is that often in many environments, the minister or the state is responsible for the appointment of the regulator. It takes a very strong focus and a good understanding of the sectors and significant political will, to be frank,
yes.
to let go of one's baby, as it were, and to allow them to operate with the freedom that acts in the best interest, as I said before, not only for investors, but also for consumers. Without getting too much into the issues, I think we all know that the tariff regimes are often highly politicized. The issues of, is it cost recovery, or is it a matter of making sure that people can get access to water and subsidizing it? And ultimately, if you want investors in these sectors, how do you make sure that they get a reasonable return? And allowing the regulator the freedom to balance the different interests of all the stakeholders is one that differs from place to place. I think in a couple of countries you see a role, I think I alluded earlier to somewhere, the role of the regulator is to advise the minister, and that does not preclude the minister responsible for that regulator from running a proper, a process and doing all of evaluating decisions in a way that does benefit everybody. I just think that most people take a great deal of comfort from a regulator who is not bound to any particular person and whose decisions are final.
And perhaps, Greg, that brings us to your perspective. You're the legal eagle here from, the legislative perspective. Clearly there must be some challenges here for regulators. And who drafts up the laws behind how regulators need to be managed as well?
Well, that's right, and that's why it's critical to have a democratic institution. And as much as we talk about regulators as individuals and so on, institutions are vital. So parliaments, democratic parliaments and so on, which go about their business of drafting laws, arguing, debating and so on. So you get to the understanding of policy, which then is legislated. So then it can be appropriately regulated by then the institution and the regulator, him or herself. So that's absolutely vital.
If I can just add to that, I mean, one of the things that we've seen in other regions of the world is, and that we think would have great value, is a periodic assessment. I think the issue of a periodic assessment of regulators, so that we can understand how well they're doing, not just on the governance side of what they do, but also the substance. Have the decisions they have taken actually benefited the various stakeholders, or what has been the impact on the various stakeholders? I think the point that Greg made so eloquently just now is that one of the real benefits of a regulator is if you can have a public process, if they can be transparent, and this is the role of parliaments, but also of consumers and interested parties. Public participation in and understanding of the process can make a huge difference in how the ultimate impact and decisions are made.
So would you say that's potentially the best approach or best practice when it comes to setting up a regulator? The involvement of the public there, as well as a democratic environment.
I absolutely agree with Gloria in regard to how she's moved this debate into that realm, because it's exactly where society is. It is the institution of parliament, but all stakeholders, consumers, investors, community members, and so on. That's where societies are developing too.
Then the question
and so then the question really is then how best about the process. It probably is an all-encompassing process.
Are we seeing enough of that though, Greg?
again, the question is, you know, it's open. It's the entire continent. In some sectors we do see it. Some jurisdictions we do see it. In most instances, we are in a fledgling or embryonic state where that is the best policies to go ahead for. But I think by and large, there's an acceptance of more transparency. By and large, an acceptance more independence. By and large, an acceptance that all stakeholders must come to the party to best develop your environment, your working and your commercial environment. And that, at the end of the day, is also an interesting aspect, is that by and large, Africa as a continent and its jurisdictions, its countries have accepted that a commercial environment is the best way forward to gain hope for its peoples. And hence then all the other issues flow.
I'd like us to pick a few examples, perhaps, if we can, of regulators who are doing a good job, which has resulted in investors showing confidence in that particular arena and funding whatever project that there might be there. Are there any that come top of mind, perhaps, Greg?
I think our energy regulator at home in South Africa it certainly has testing times, but it's really gone through those testing times very well indeed. And those are very highly politicized issues in regard to tariff increases. It affects businesses, consumers, ordinary members of the public and so on, and it really has come through some very, very testing times. And at the end of the day, we've got a renewable program in terms of infrastructure, which certainly is at the top of any program that one may think of in terms of infrastructure globally. It has been heralded and really won enormous plaudits for its ability to regulate itself, to deliver on investment promises and so on. So there's a very fine example, I think, as a South African I speak, and one looks elsewhere. In Namibia, the regulator in the power sector also does a particularly good job and so on. So I think I love to see the optimistic side of things, and I think that's the play, and I think we're moving in that sort of direction.
Well, certainly the glass is half full and not half empty.
No, that's right.
Indeed, but we will delve a little bit deeper into our discussion today as we have to go to a short break, but more on infrastructure regulation when we return and we look at the level of accountability that regulators have to uphold. Don't go away. Well, still with my guest today are Greg Knott, Head of Africa Practice at Werksmans Attorneys, as well as Gloria Mamba, who's the MD at Global Environment Fund. Lady and gent, just before the ad break, we were discussing some typical or rather good examples of regulators that we've seen in South Africa as well as across the continent. But what about the level of accountability that these regulators have to stand up to? And it seems as though we need to create a culture and an environment whereby accountability is demanded. I take it from a stakeholder perspective, we need to cultivate that. Is that a bit of a challenge, or are we moving towards that trend, Greg?
Again, it's education of a population in terms of their rights. What rights have they got in regard to holding a regulator accountable? And so, you know, in South Africa we have a constitution. We have constitutional rights. We can take a regulator to court and so on. So if you've got a system of a rule of law which is embedded within a country, so much the better. Then the accountability at the end of the day will be that much easier for your consumer, your investor, whoever they may say, in regard to hold that regulator accountable.
And I think that the point you make about education is excellent, Greg. It is about understanding the role of the regulator,
Yes.
our rights with the regulator. And I think what's important as the education process evolves is that people will understand that it is not necessarily a confrontational discussion.
Yes.
I think if we come to an understanding that we are all about creating a system in which the playing field is level, that the beneficiaries are on all sides, both, as we talked about earlier, investors, consumers, providers of the energy or water or whatever it is. I think that we will come to a very strong position where people understand that they must participate, and that we're looking for a solution that is win-win for everyone.
I think Gloria makes an absolutely fabulous point, and I suppose I rush to the courts being a lawyer, but there are other opportunities to hold regulators accountable, and I think Gloria makes a very good point in that regard. It's about a win-win situation, because at the end of the day we have to work together as both the consumer, investor and the regulator, regulating the various policies. So I think it's a very fine point.
So are there particular methods perhaps in which we can cultivate that education and that knowledge where we hold regulators accountable?
Well, again, I think looking at the particular sectors, you know, the industry leaders of those particular sectors, whether they be in government or industry or so on, must make that particular sector, I think that's a good starting point, aware of the regulator's role. And of course, the regulator himself or herself, that institution, will do that particular educating of what their role is and so on.
I think we've spoken a lot about nascent industries and fledgling environments. We've spoken about energy and we've spoken about water, which is even further back than. But I think if you think about the telecommunications situation and what has happened, we all own mobile phones. We all take an interest in the tariff regime, and we all understand what the interconnection fees are and why it's important that these are regulated. I mean, when we talk about public comment of spectrum issuing and all of that, these are issues that, because we have become more familiar with the product, and it is so much a part of our daily lives, we have interest, and we participate probably more actively. There's probably more scope. We could certainly do more, but I think we understand that sector particularly well as consumers, as financiers, and I think ultimately energy and water and transport, you name it, will end up in the same place. I think even all the discussion that has happened around tolling of roads is that sort of engagement is important in the education process and in feeling that people have a right to discuss and understand what it is they're paying for.
That brings me to a comment that Greg made at the top of the show, that many people call for too little regulation or too much. From a South African perspective, are we getting it right? Maybe is government taking a stern stance in finding appropriate regulators for the different industries, or are we succeeding in certain pockets and lacking in others?
It's always going to be a case of doing one's best, I think. You know, whether we ever receive 100% mark, it's probably doubtful. But I think certainly the trend is correct. What one doesn't want to do is over red tape a particular sector.
And that would stifle investment.
That would stifle investment. As much as investors want certainty, they also don't want to go about their business in such a way that it doesn't pay them to do business in a particular country. So there again is the fine balance as well. But as in terms of the trends in regard to regulators, have we enough regulators, or do we have too few? The trend is we seem to be getting it, in the sectors that count at the moment, we seem to be getting it right, I'd like to say. But again, there are nascent industries which probably will need a stronger, better regulator in the days to come. And you'll see that in the different countries as we look at the continent.
What does this mean, perhaps? Oh, you can go on. Okay, go ahead, Gloria.
I think we all benefit from lessons learned. You know, I think we all are able to draw within the continent from people who have done very good aspects of regulation of certain sectors, and we also learn from people who have made mistakes. I think we think if we think in a global context, clearly there are other regions of the world that have tried different forms of regulation, and if we and I think certainly part of how the Department of Energy has run the refit program is the benefit of that experience. We don't have subsidized tariffs in that process, and rather have gone for a process in which people bid the tariff, and that is because we've learned from experiences in other parts of the world. So I think there's always going to be improvement. I think we have the benefit of leapfrogging certain mistakes that other people have made, and we'll always be fine-tuning the system. There's no system that's perfect.
I think that's 100% correct.
Indeed. Yeah. That brings us back to the African continent, perhaps. You mentioned that there's certain areas and certain countries who are performing fairly well, but will we ever see the need or a time when there'll be a continental or interstate regulator? That again might be a challenge, given the fact that there are different laws as well as languages in the various African countries.
I think the move to regionalization, whether it's east, west, north, south, and particularly the east-west at the moment, the demand for regionalization, to make big infrastructure projects profitable, to make them work, will bring that particular demand and need, will look ultimately to, say, a single regulator or regulatory body in specific sectors. So I think we will go there, and I think there's certainly a move. Under NEPAD, there has been a great drive to regionalize, to to break down barriers. And there too I see the regulator playing a fundamental and extraordinarily positive role in more of that regionalization.
And perhaps that might have a positive impact on investors as well, Gloria. Instead of targeting a particular country, you gain access to a region.
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about the infrastructure challenges in Africa, I think it's the World Bank that estimates that there's $360 billion that needs to be spent on infrastructure just to get us where we need to be by 2020. I think the recurring theme also is that despite the great economic growth we've seen across the continent, I think it's greater than 6% over the past 10 years. We could be doing better. I think the African Development Bank quoted a statistic that said we are losing 2% of what could be annual GDP growth because of inadequate infrastructure. So the challenge then is what can we do? And the biggest areas of challenge are not only within country. It is about these 15 landlocked countries who need to get their goods to port. It is about getting the railway systems, the road transport systems. And I think, again, we have a statistic from the African Development Bank that says road usage in Africa, because of the quality of the roads and because of the lack of density of roads, means 34%. We only have about 34%. That being the case, we really do need to develop road systems and rail systems and ports that cross borders to be able to make sure that regions are able to cover the infrastructure, to provide the infrastructure that's necessary. And these are issues that are really not going to be possible without a single and common regulator in different regions.
And just on that, doesn't that also mean perhaps that we need to look at reforms or looking at the legal perspective of not only regulations but those particular sectors? If we want to develop a fantastic highway or railway from Zambia through to South Africa out via
and it goes
Durban,
to all sorts of issues, visas, permits, all of those that block trade within our continent.
Has that conversation started, Greg?
That conversation has started. In fact, I was privy to a conversation at the World Economic Forum in Africa a couple of years back when a number of the presidents were sitting there and they spoke about visas. That one takes a passport on the one end of Africa and ends up with a full passport on the other side of it because of the need for visa applications. Now, that in itself affects trade, it affects free movement and so forth. So, and that needs to be regulated. And permits. I mean, one of our clients, for instance, spends $20,000 just ensuring permits for a particular entree into one of the countries. Again, unacceptable. And so there's got to be move. And I think that accountability will come. More transparency will hopefully affect how business is done and move to a far more consistent playing field.
Indeed. Well, we certainly are looking forward to that. But looking at these institutions, some of them that you have mentioned just before the break, that are regulators, aren't they exposed to threats perhaps of fragility because of their lack of independence, or because, as you mentioned, they're in this embryonic phase, still need to grow and learn to crawl, need to walk and be established as powerful regulators? Do you think that that's a concern for many of the regulators that you perhaps have exposure to, Gloria?
I think capacity is a concern. I think we talked about it's on-the-job learning, and I think that's always a concern. But I think that to give credit where it's due, there has been significant ramp-up fairly quickly. When you think about the period that is covered in regulation of even telecoms and how quickly we have become quite sophisticated in that space, I think there's encouraging news and trends for the other sectors that we're talking about.
I absolutely agree with that comment.
So definitely some lessons to be learned. Before we go, lady and gent, your closing comments perhaps as to what the future outlook of regulators in South Africa look like. 10 seconds each. Greg?
Future in South Africa or Africa?
Let's start.
On the continent, I think the future of regulators is going to be a rosy one. There's a need for regulation. There's a need for the institution. There's a need for the regulator for him or herself. So I think, given that fact, there's going to be a great future for the regulator, given the growth of our continent.
Given the growth of our continent, great future. Gloria, 10 seconds.
This is not a very exciting conversation because we keep agreeing with each other. But I am going to agree with you too. I think the future is positive. I think we have seen enough trends going in the right direction that give comfort to people who are looking to the regulator to provide stability and financial viability to their investments. I think it's about whether you believe the glass is half full or half empty, and we're taking the view that it's half full and that we expect the positive trends to continue for the foreseeable future.
Positivity all around. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Well, we have come to the end of this week's edition of Invest Africa. Thanks to both of my guests, Greg Knott, he's the Head of Africa Practice at Werksmans Attorneys, as well as Gloria Mamba, who's the MD at Global Environment Fund. Well, Bruce Whitfield is up next as he unpacks the latest news from South Africa's economy on Tonight with Bruce. Until next time, it's goodbye and thank you for joining us.